Sarah is the best intern for reminding me to record. So let's try that again. So thank you for joining us today. At New Jersey Advocates for Aging Well, we are working with many partners throughout the state to help bring age-friendly initiatives down to the local level and see change and progress made in New Jersey. And accessory dwelling units are a promising option for both affordable and appropriate housing in New Jersey. Several towns have already passed ordinances to allow them, and there is a proposed bill at the state level, which Christina can fill us in more on, that would allow them throughout the state. We think that they're a very important strategic tool to build affordable and appropriate housing, especially for older adults, whether an ADU is used by a family so that their older relatives can move in nearby, or to share the costs of living, to be able to provide caregiving services, or even to bring in a supplemental income for older adults. All of these things can make it easier and more affordable for people to stay independent as long as possible. But the actual growth of ADUs has remained very slow. One thing is lack of experience, lack of knowledge, and still getting the word out. So today, in order to help us bring ADUs to your communities and answer your questions, please welcome Christina Kata from Regional Planning Association, architect Marina Rubina from the Princeton area, and Lippel from Montclair Gateway to Aging in Place. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Christina.
Thank you so much, Kathy. And hi, everybody. My name is Christina. I'm from Regional Plan Association. I'm going to share my screen so we can get this presentation kicked off. Please let me know in the chat if you have any issues seeing the screen or any issues with my audio. So before we get started, what's RPA? RPA is a urban planning nonprofit organization. We've been around for about 100 years, and we focus primarily on the New York metropolitan area. It's outlined here on this map, but it includes New York City, Hudson Valley, Long Island, Southwestern Connecticut, and Northern New Jersey. Northern New Jersey, also including Ocean County, which is a little funny sometimes, but we do consider it part of the commuting area for New York City. So why are we here today to talk about ADUs? Well, first and foremost, we are in a housing crisis. I think this is familiar to almost everybody on this call, but New Jersey has the third highest housing burden in the nation. A third of homeowners pay more than 30% of their income towards housing. Average rent has increased by more than a third in New Jersey, which is more than the national average. And housing costs in New Jersey have risen over 20% in about the last 10 years. So we all know there's a housing crisis, but why is there a housing crisis? And a couple of articles have started to come out about this. Primarily, it's a supply and demand issue. We have still not recovered from the Great Recession, and our population has increased. And in fact, the 65+ group in New Jersey has increased by a third. We have been making headway into addressing our supply issue. And in fact, Northern New Jersey has punched far and above its own weight in terms of housing production, but we still have quite a ways to go. So an old idea that's become popular again across the country and locally is the legalization of accessory dwelling units. And I guess I want to pause here and kind of just ask the crowd, either put it in the chat or even just use the raise hand signal. How many of you have never heard of ADUs before coming to this call? Great. So it feels like most of us are pretty familiar with the concepts. That's awesome. But accessory dwelling units can be a attached or detached addition to a primary dwelling. They can be, as you saw on the previous slide and on this one, they can be part of the house as a basement conversion or an attic conversion. They can be attached to the main property. They can also be detached either by converting a garage or building a new structure entirely. And Marina and Anne are going to go into a couple more examples of what ADUs actually look like, but here are just a couple of visualizations for folks who may not be as familiar. These are images that we included in our Be My Neighbor report from around 2020. So you can see here, as you're walking down the street, 9 times out of 10, you wouldn't even spot an ADU from the street. Either they would be part of the house itself, and so it looks like just an extension of the main living space, or just like an addition on the side, or it would be a detached in the back, which wouldn't be easily seen from the street level. And here's an example actually on the right-hand side of a photo taken from the Bradley Beach, Neptune area. There is a grandfathered ADU in the backyard of that property, but you can't see it from the street. So what's going on with ADUs right now? There's no statewide law about ADUs in New Jersey. Several towns have recently adopted ADU ordinances. Other towns banned ADUs many years ago, but they've grandfathered in existing properties. Right now, if you wanted to build an ADU in New Jersey, you would have to go through a pretty rigorous process with your municipality, working with them to see if you could file the paperwork in order to do it. Some municipalities have recognized it's a lot of labor for homeowners, and so they have made it so that you can do ADUs more efficiently or as of rights, depending if you fit certain criteria. So very, very recently, Jersey City and Newark have passed ordinances that have amended their zoning code to allow for ADUs in certain areas. Maplewood, Montclair, Princeton, South Orange are a couple other areas that have ADUs. And we, as Regional Plan Association, have, as a previous initiative, we interviewed some folks that actually have benefited from having an ADU. These are the ones that have been grandfathered in. And I recommend that you go check out our website to go see these videos, but we had a really wonderful time speaking with a homeowner who had a property with an ADU, rented out the ADU for rental income. And then as she got older, she actually transitioned to living in the ADU while one of her sons lived in the primary dwelling. And so for her, it was a great way to age in place. But I'm going to skip that video for the sake of time today. What's happening nationally? ADUs are picking up steam, and they're becoming a larger source of housing across the country. 8 states have either legalized ADUs as a right or amended older laws to increase housing options. In our area, that's Connecticut and Vermont and New Hampshire, Maine, West Coast, it's California, Oregon, Washington. We also have Utah stepping in as well. When we talk about ADUs on a nationwide scale, the real heavy hitter is California. So California has been constantly tweaking its ADU legislation, and currently 20% of all new housing that's being built, about 20,000 units a year, are ADUs. So California has really been like leaps and beyond in terms of what's been happening on the East Coast. Connecticut, in contrast, they adopted legislation in 2021 allowing ADUs as a right statewide. Regional Plan Association was actually part of that effort, along with Desegregate Connecticut and others. Unfortunately, with the Connecticut bill, towns could choose to opt out. So we're coming out with a report about this soon, but what we've seen is about 1/3 have decided to use the state's guidelines for ADUs, and about 2/3 have opted out. And then it kind of depends on the municipality. Some of them have actually tweaked their ordinances to be more in line with the state's guidelines, even if they have opted out. Some have decided to come up with their own guidelines entirely, and some of them have actually been successful. And some have decided to come up with ordinances that really forestall ADU development and make it very cumbersome. For example, New Haven kept tweaking their ADU ordinance, and they made it so constrained that, in fact, after a year of having a new ordinance on the books, there wasn't a single new ADU built as of right. So clearly the New Haven one isn't working. And then there are a couple other examples that I've included on this slide. Utah has actually a really interesting model that I just want to pause here and kind of reflect on for a second. They adopted legislation that basically said, we need more housing. We're going to give you guys a menu of options. ADUs is one of those options. And I think that's kind of a takeaway from today's conversations. ADUs are not going to solve today's housing crisis, but they are a tool in the toolbox that's a relatively light lift compared to other initiatives to increase housing density. They're a very gentle form of density, and they can serve a lot of purposes for aging adults, young adults, and a variety of families. So let's talk a little bit about the challenges to creating ADUs. And I phrase this as there are challenges, but there's also solutions. So you're never just stuck. There's always a way to get around it. And the first one is just awareness. A lot of the times, unless you're following along your local politics, you might not even realize that your town has an ADU ordinance. You might not even know what an ADU is. So first and foremost, we recommend that towns should make sure that homeowners know that this is available and that they know the local guidelines and the steps that they can take to put one on their property. Some towns have held webinars and they've posted fact sheets and they've published guidelines. Others have been a little bit quieter, I guess, being a little bit more concerned about the rollout, and some really don't know how to approach this, and they're kind of like building the airplane as they're flying, and so they're a little bit hesitant to put information out there. But really what we recommend is first and foremost that towns should take a proactive approach in informing residents that they can do this if they have an ordinance on the books. The next big one, and we're going to talk about this further on the next slide, but cost of construction. Cost of construction is a very big one. There are estimates all over the place, and Marina, I might get into this as well, but depending if it's attached or detached, the cost to construct an ADU can be a lot. There's some people who have said low six figures. So there's something to keep in mind, the fact that there's a big financial gap for families if they don't have a lot of equity in their homes. So there are some states and localities that have actually taken measures to address this. So New York State has a +1 ADU program. They are partnering with community groups around the state. And very recently, like as of 2 weeks ago, New York City's HPD, which is their Department of Housing Preservation and Development, has launched a new pilot program. It's a very small pilot. It's only helping up to 15 families to build ADUs on their properties. But what's going to happen is New York City is going to provide financing of up to $395,000 for each of those 15 families, which is really going to like help them meet those financial targets. Another issue that people have approached is design. If you've never built an ADU, it can be complicated. Contractors might not be familiar with it. There might be architects in your area that are familiar with it, but there might not be. There are some towns that have looked at templates as a solution to this. So Seattle created 10 detached ADU templates, which allowed for faster permitting and approval. Essentially, if you came up to Seattle and you said, I want to build an ADU and I want to build one of these 10, depending on your lot and depending on some other things, it would be fast tracked, and about like 1,000 ADUs were permitted during the prior year in like 2023, which was a 250% increase from their numbers in 2019 from before the ordinance went into effect. So there is a big help in actually having clear design guidelines from municipalities. And then zoning and parking barriers can be a big one. Parking can be a third rail in suburban communities. I am here as a representative of an urban planning organization to tell you that we have too much parking. And there are fantastic academics that have gone into this at great length. We have more space allocated for parking in this country than for housing. It is okay to eliminate parking requirements for ADUs. By and large, the people who will occupy ADUs are either going to be aging adults who may not need access necessarily to a car, or they may be young adults who are close enough to transit that they will be commuting in and out. Oregon recognized this as an issue for ADUs, and they recently limited parking requirements. There's also a fantastic presentation happening at the Blaustein School in New Brunswick next Wednesday around 4:30 p.m. That is going to be talking all about parking. So highly recommend if you guys want to learn more about it. 4:30 p.m. Blaustein, right in the middle of New Brunswick, 10 minutes away from the train station. But to wrap it up, let's talk a little bit about financing. Financing is actually, along with the increase in mortgage rates, financing is like the biggest hurdle for ADUs. So a couple states and localities have recognized that, and they've started offering incentives and financing programs. I talked about the ones in New York and New York City. The federal government has also started to take a look at this. So very recently, the FHA has, they put up a rule for feedback, and they've changed it such that borrowers can use a portion of their actual or prospective rental income from an ADU and have it added to their effective income for purposes of qualifying for an FHA-backed mortgage. This can increase access to mortgage credit while seeking to purchase properties with ADUs, add ADUs to existing structures or construct new homes with ADUs. And then other federal entities have also kind of like taken a look at this. So Freddie Mac has said that if you want to include the rental income from an ADU in your underwriting, you can do that as long as it's going to be a 1-unit property that's going to be used as a primary residence. And then Fannie Mae offers home ready loans to help purchase or refinance a home with an existing ADU. There's also traditional home equity loans and HELOCs. Again, just keeping in mind that a lot of this really kind of depends on your, like, an individual homeowner's amount of equity in their property, the current mortgage climate, and everything else that's been just going on. But I will say more and more banks are becoming familiar with ADUs, and the fact that the White House has been talking very publicly about ADUs has helped kind of bring this idea more. It's becoming more common and it's becoming talked about more often. I think as people talk about it more, people are getting more comfortable with it. And so there are some local banks, especially in California, where this has been more common, that have become way more comfortable in filing mortgages with ADUs, or at least giving out loans for the construction of an ADU. So hopefully, as we see this idea grow, we will see more and more financial institutions kind of step up here. And then in terms of next steps, so Kathy kicked this off by talking about what was happening state, and I do want to talk about that right now. And as I mentioned earlier, there is no statewide law. We are currently in lame duck. We are, as an organization, we have been working with a coalition of individuals, many of whom are actually on this call, to push for ADUs in the legislature. There have been a couple of bills in the legislature floating around. One bill passed the Senate, and what we would like to see are significant changes made to that bill. There were a couple of additions to it, floor amendments that were added that we weren't really comfortable with. And we're hoping that changes will be made. It's called, I think this accompanying assembly bill is A1987. So we're still kind of waiting on our end to see what happens on the state level. And we have been pushing for more and more activity on that front. And to that point, and I'll drop this in the chat, we actually have a sign-on letter that we are preparing to send to Governor Murphy that's been signed on by a variety of groups, including many members on this call. So I'll drop that in the chat after I stop sharing my screen. I encourage you all to take a look. And if you haven't signed on, please reach out to me and I'm happy to walk you through that. But I'll stop there and give the floor back to Kathy.
Thank you very much. And as Marina gets her screen set up, I have a question that it just kind of boggles me, because whenever I've heard, resistance to ADUs, the first thing that comes up is parking. Why is parking the knee-jerk reaction? I mean, I have neighbors that have 1 car for an entire family. I have a neighbor who collects cars and has 4. Doesn't matter. There's no limit to the number of cars you can put in your driveway. So why is that such a reaction when people start talking about ADUs?
I think parking is always something that comes up in terms of conversations in more suburban communities. You'll hear it a lot. I remember when I gave a presentation fairly recently, we had an attorney from one of the towns, and she said, when I first started this job 20 years ago, people were complaining about parking in downtown, and now 20 years later, people are still complaining about parking in downtown. I think there needs to be a reframing of our relationship with personal vehicles. I say this as somebody who actually doesn't have a car, and I get around through public transit, by walking, by rideshare, by a variety of methods. And I think there's something also to say, we've gotten very comfortable with building our towns around vehicles, and there needs to be a shift to making towns more walkable, more pedestrian oriented, safer for bikes and for walkers and for people of all ages. When you design for cars, you're designing for a very specific segment of the population. Mm-hmm. And then as soon as you have mobility issues, or as soon as you start having kids and you have everything else going on, all of a sudden, like, it's funny, like, how many populations cars actually don't serve. But we always design for cars, and we've been designing for cars for decades. And I think in this country, especially with the climate crisis and everything else that we're facing right now, we really need to rethink that mentality. We have to be a little bit comfortable with being uncomfortable. and start moving our bodies more, start walking a little bit more in our downtowns, and recognizing that some individuals have mobility issues, but be comfortable with not having ready access to a car. And if you do have a car, be comfortable with the fact that you might have to park a little bit further away from where you want to go.
Okay. All right. Hey, thank you so much. If anybody, again, if you have questions, put them in the chat and we will circle back later. And right now I'm going to turn this over to Marina Rubina. Thank you so much for joining us today. It is all yours.
Hello. Are you guys able to hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. So thank you so much, Christina, for kicking us off, and Kathy for hosting. My job here today is to speak from a point of view of an architect who has done many, many ADUs, and to share the excitement and tell you that there are many things we can learn, and try to make the best of them. But ADUs are such a great idea. The question here today we're discussing is, why aren't there more of them? Let's see if I can get my screen to move. There we go. So I would like to start again by restating the problem. What is it preventing us from building more ADUs? And Christina started by explaining some of these things, and I'll go in a little bit of more detail. So the interest rates and financing are a really big barrier. And it's so exciting to hear that on the federal level, the rules are being changed to allow for more creative ways of using ADU income to qualify for mortgages. But we're also a little bit of in a perfect storm situation where, even if that is allowed, the problem we're facing right now, that people have low rates on their current mortgages. So if somebody has a 3% rate on their mortgage, if they decide to build an ADU and they need to refinance, that will be refinanced at the current rate of 8%. And that pretty much kills all the interest right there. So in reality, maybe these would be possible, but they're not happening because of such a difference in people's current interest rates and what their interest rate will be at the time of the ADU. So the only ability to actually finance ADUs right now without impacting people's current mortgages are home equity loans. And there are some companies that are starting to get into this market to provide sort of a secondary mortgage that wouldn't impact the primary mortgage, so people could maintain their original mortgage at their original rate and pull equity out of their homes to create accessory dwelling units. So we a little bit in a perfect storm of this. Again, as Christina started talking about, construction is incredibly expensive right now. Coming out of post-pandemic, it's just really expensive to build. So you need to borrow money. You can't borrow money. Construction is really expensive. Right? What a perfect storm. And then on top of it, we have a situation where the processes that local municipalities set up are stressful, frustrating, confusing, and also expensive. And in part because municipalities are not familiar, they're trying to sort of protect themselves and throw additional requirements that they just don't necessarily know how to deal with. For example, a lot of the ADUs require separate utility connections. And with the current construction costs, if you have to run separate utilities for a 1-bedroom little house, that pretty much takes such a huge toll that at that point, it may not even be feasible, right? You have just buried $100,000 underground, running all of your utilities down to the backyard, and you haven't even gotten out of the ground yet. So the point of my picture here is sometimes you feel you're just going around in circles in a maze and you're bumping into dead ends. So don't be surprised if that's how it feels. But in order to find sort of a way to think about it is what I would like to propose, that what if we think about ADUs a bit like pancakes? Being Thanksgiving, we'll all spend time with family cooking. Let's just make it fun and think about it that way. So the solution really is we need all types of pancakes, meaning ADUs, really. So ADUs could be from scratch. They could be from a box, or they could be ready-made, just like pancakes. So think pancakes. So here's a solution. If here we have a homeowner, and she's actually pictured right there, who had a split level. And this was a while back in Princeton, where they were not even considered ADUs at this point, but they were called flats. A lot of towns had these strange various ordinances that would allow something like ADUs. So this woman right here in Princeton decided that she needed a place for her daughter who came back from college, and they didn't want her to stay in the house. So what they did is they converted this lower level of a split level into an accessory dwelling unit. So from the outside, doesn't even look any different. You could see there's a door, one could go in and out. So for people like this who are trying to sort of from scratch make these ADU pancakes, what would be really helpful for towns to do is to simplify the processes, try to streamline the approvals, be very, very clear with the information that's available. And this is already done on the West Coast, where either the municipal website would have very clear, here's the application, here are the steps, here are some options, so it's not so much fishing around for information, but it's all in one place in one form. There are also local organizations that could be started out that advocate, that have pre-selected all this information, put a package together. That would be really helpful. Another thing that I would like to propose, I don't know of any towns doing it, but it could be done, is deferring tax increases, because a lot of people, once they put in an EDU, the tax assessor comes along like, oh, great, let me raise your taxes. And again, that pretty much wipes out all of the benefits. So what could be done is some towns, for example, more on the West Coast, basically freeze tax increases, but that may not work. So what towns could do is they could say, we will defer your tax increase, where the taxes that would be due on the increase in value could go into sort of effectively a lien. And when the house gets sold, those get paid to the town. That could be one way of doing it. And then, as I started to mention, eliminating the requirement for additional utilities would be really, really helpful, because literally in this particular case, that bedroom was already there. Nothing additional is needed. To require additional utilities would be prohibitively expensive. And so some towns are already doing that, and the hope is in the statewide bill, that would be one of the benefits, hopefully, that they wouldn't require additional utilities. So not all of us are competent enough to make pancakes from scratch. Some of us are better architects than cooks. So what we're also trying to do is make your ADU from a box, right? Where you could select basically a pre-made ADU. So we have clients, for example, here. This is a couple who live in Princeton, and they have 2 jobs, 2 kids. They're busy. They do not have time to deal with building an ADU from scratch. So they hired a company, and I said, okay, we just want you to do it. Here, we need it. We have aging parents. My mother's in a wheelchair. Do it. I don't know how you're going to do it. I want it done. So what we're actually proposing is doing prefabricated accessory dwelling units that will be pre-made and delivered and set on their property. So what would be really helpful for these ADUs in a box, what would be, technology gets developed, prefabrication keeps on improving, but what would be really helpful for these is if we had uniform regulations on larger areas, because creating new technologies on small scale, it just does not, a lot of people don't want to do it. So for example, in California, where it's a huge state, all the regulations are the same throughout the state. They have lots of companies that came in and already pre-done the research, set up all the technologies that you could get these prefabricated ADUs. Once New Jersey gets to that level where we have consistent regulations, it would be much easier. So what about the ready-made, you know, sometimes you don't want to make any pancakes. You just want to go to a restaurant and get pancakes, right? And enjoy them. So we already have ADUs that have existed. They were just not called ADUs. So these are some examples from Princeton that, you know, used to be these carriage houses that people had apartments that used to be apartments for au pair. Or like in this particular case, this was a house, this right here on top of this garage is an apartment. So what could we do to make these easier? So one thing that has really helped the Princeton ADUs, and we do have a lot of them already, both of these existing ones and new ones, is allowing people to sell them separately. This is a very radical idea that was adopted as part of the Princeton ADU, but recently, literally as of maybe less than a month ago, the state of California went and changed their ADU ordinance to allow that also on the statewide level. So what that allows to do is that when housing is built new, that allows having the ability to sell it separately, encourages developers to put ADUs in, and then they could be either sold as part of a larger package or separately. And then also having no occupancy requirement is also really helpful, because then both could be rented, one could be rented. It just creates more flexibility. So here's an example of what I would call a ready-made ADU. So this is what it will hopefully look like. This is it under construction. So this is a developer-built model. Because they're allowed to be sold separate, developers are interested. So now we have, here's the main house being built. Here's a corner ADU being constructed. Here it is. So here are some already completed. So this one was, again, ready-made, developer built. So there's a main house, and this is an accessory dwelling unit that was constructed. Here it is from the outside. Here it is from the inside. An actual dog, how long it took us to get him to sit still for the picture. That was a lot of fun. But it is really helpful to incentivize and create opportunities for people to do this. So to go back to my analogy, is ADUs are just like pancakes. Let's think about it this way. They are awesome. They're not a panacea. They're not going to solve all of our problems. Not all size fits all, by no means. And just like pancakes, they may not come out right sometimes, especially on the first try, as we know. And also, forever and ever, how many people have had debates about, you know, whether it's best to bake pancakes from scratch or best to get them in a box or better just not try. So these debates will not go away. But I think the point is, the more options we have, and both easy and complex, the more people will have them. So I hope that the takeaway, these are fun, these are awesome, and they will help. So let's all try to think about it that way. If anybody has any questions about pancakes, not for me, but I'm happy to answer questions about ADUs.
Thank you very much, Marina. That's going to help me remember it more with the pancake analogy.
Excellent,
Excellent
excellent.
analogy. Okay. And next we have Anne Lippel from Montclair. And Anne, I will let you get your screen set up. You know, Montclair has been kind of at the forefront, along with Princeton, on age-friendly efforts in New Jersey. It's one of the first towns, I think the only second to Princeton, to be designated an age-friendly community. And I know it's only a few miles from me. Like a lot of North Jersey, we have very tight spaces. We have very high cost of living. We have very high home prices. So it seems like a real opportunity for ADUs to make an impact on the housing market up in the North Jersey area. So Anne, are you good to share your screen?
I just want to know if you're seeing it. If you're not, it means I didn't.
No, let me make sure I've given you the power.
I have. Okay. Let's just see now if I get it. Okay, hold on. Okay.
And
got it.
Not seeing it yet.
I know.
One of the things that while she's doing that, I wonder, Marina and Christina, it's, there's opposition to ADUs, but up in this area, well, in a lot of states, there seems to be no opposition to taking a smaller house and turning it into a McMansion. So why is it just doesn't seem to be balanced for people to resist adding smaller housing units, but not have a problem with taking, like, a ranch, which would be so helpful for people to be able to downsize when they're older, and turning it into this, gigantic thing with a 4-car garage and 3 stories. So that it doesn't seem balanced.
Kathy, I am so glad you brought that up. And one thing is, we have a Connecticut branch called the group leading it really is Accessory Connecticut. And Pete Harrison, one of our staff members, has been doing something great. He starts on social media. He has Mansion Monday. And what he does is he posts on social media on their account saying, look at this gigantic mansion in southwestern Connecticut that's allowed to be built as a right. Oftentimes ruining a starter home and building a McMansion on top of it. Meanwhile, dense multifamily housing by train stations, oh no. Or small ADUs, meh. And I think it's the there's more psychology to that than anything else. And it really is, I think, fear of the other. There are a lot of members in communities who have been established and they want to maintain their property values. They want to maintain their communities. They almost want to fossilize them in amber. And the idea that things will change, even if it could be a change for the better, change scares them. And they also are afraid of people coming in that they don't know. And so there's very much like a fear of the other and a fear of change. Oftentimes people are having a knee-jerk reaction, and like if there's any kind of threat to their property value, the knee-jerk reaction becomes a very aggressive knee-jerk reaction. I don't know, Marina, if you want to add to that, but that's what we've been seeing.
Can you see my screen now, Kathy?
Yeah, we can, Ann. Thanks. So
I'm very much in agreement with Christina. I think that we are actually seeing opposition to the mansions as well. So I wouldn't say that there's no opposition, but I think the issue is, I find that the default option is always single family home. So whenever there's any change, it always comes to what is the default, what is already allowed. So that's why the big mansions get built, because they're already written in the code. Nobody needs to change anything. It's the default option. But if we think about it, how many times have we, looked at the default option on our phone? Is it really the correct one for us, right? You get a new device and you don't know how it works, right? You just go with the default. So if we set the default correctly to something that is benefiting everybody and not the giant mansion being the default, that's when we may get actual change. So I'm super curious to hear what Ann will talk about, and then we can continue this conversation in the Q&A.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Ann, we have you up now, and I know from experience, Ann is not afraid to ask challenging questions and to push the boundaries. So please take it away and tell us what you've done recently in Montclair.
Okay, just to fill in the missing pieces, I'm in charge of an organization called Montclair Gateway to Aging in Place. We are a nonprofit. We were formed by modern elders, and I'm going to use that terminology as opposed to seniors, because public policy was not responding to our needs. And so we're here to fill in the gap, hence MGAP is our acronym. We're the fastest growing demographic in the US. Baby boomers are retiring at the rate of 10,000 individuals a day. Why is that important? Because if you want to change the default, you look to the baby boomers to make the change. And this is actually something that we're finding is happening in our community. Okay. AARP has been a leader in raising the awareness about the silver tsunami, but our advocacy work started a decade ago. I don't need you to understand every one of these components, but you will see a decade of work in trying to get a township to adopt an ADU ordinance. Why? NIMBYism is a big part of it. Another is the reluctance to change. So I'm going to borrow one of Marina's phrases. We want to change NIMBYism to YIMBYism, not in my backyard, to yes in my backyard. And that's because ADUs provide rental incomes for the homeowner. Now, we've been talking about how this will suit modern elders. It can suit modern elders in very important ways. As a homeowner, they get rental income if they have an extra unit. That income will help to pay those very hefty property taxes. That rental income could also be used if they move out of the big house and into the ADU and actually get market rate rental income from the big house. And since they're a landlord, they can barter with the ADU resident or the other resident for services like snow removal, garbage removal, even helping with grocery packages, anything that would help them age in place. And that is actually what we have been focused on. So we engaged, we were lucky enough to receive 2 grants to organize an ADU design competition. As I mentioned, AARP has been trying to increase the awareness about ADUs for a long time, since 2019, in fact, when they wrote their first booklet on the issue. And now they're challenging organizations to apply for grants on their Community Challenge Grant program. And in 2023, we were lucky enough to get an AARP challenge grant. And we also got a grant from Partners for Health to actually organize a competition among architecture students. These were architecture students in the Northeast Quadrant who would understand the demographics and the streetscape that the first ring suburbs of the Northeast hold. You know, we're living in houses that reflect the old style man and his castle, except castles are damp and they're very hard to maintain. So we've done surveys of modern elders and found that they have a different goal in mind. As they age in place, they want something that's comfortable, efficient, not so heavy to clean, and also has access to nature. So our intent in organizing this competition was to educate the public, people like ourselves, people who might not want this in their backyard, but also to educate municipal leaders, because seeing is believing. And so we thought by having actual representations of an ADU in context in our town, we would help spread the word. We were also interested in sensitizing our young architects to the housing needs of modern elders. And this is not trivial, because as Marina has already reflected, there is a knee-jerk action sometimes among people who are building, that they know what you want. But in fact, they may not know what we want. And so we wanted to make these young architects aware. And in the process, we've actually had feedback from the young architects that they now learn a little bit about our needs, which is excellent. And then most importantly, we want to reinforce the idea that architects shape community and not just merely framed dwellings. And in fact, ADUs protect those streetscapes that so many people in the first ring suburbs value, as opposed to high-rise density. So if we're lacking in housing options for aging in place, and we can do it with what Christina has called gentle densification, that is taking a first ring suburb home for a single family and adding a unit to it that would allow for more density without disrupting the street, well, that's a good thing. What the ADU basics are, and the FHA has stated this clearly, it must be subordinate in size to the primary dwelling. It has to have the following separate features: a means of ingress and egress, only one door is needed, a kitchen, a sleeping area, a bathing area, and bathroom facilities. The kitchen must at minimum contain cabinets, a countertop, a sink with running water, and a stove or a stove hookup. You cannot get away with calling something an ADU if it has a hot plate, a microwave, or a toaster oven. So these were some of the things that we gave as basics to the young architects. Young architects respond to something called a brief. And a credible brief has to include this shared vision of what they're supposed to be designing for, that is modern elders in this case, a separate domicile, not connected to the house, not carved out of the house, not a reconstructed garage. A listing of primary zoning limitations was also in our brief, and that's very important, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more explicitly in a minute. And a communication of human needs, especially those germane to modern elders. That means barrier-free, where a wheelchair or a walker can easily get in and out, no sills between the rooms for tripping, doorways that will be big enough to accommodate, handles instead of doorknobs, and especially in the bathroom, a walk-in shower, and bars for standing up when you're on the toilet. These are often categorized as universal design, but since the zoning in Montclair does not require universal design, we had to articulate some of these in our design brief separately. Then we had to talk about environmental considerations, not only because Montclair had terrible flooding 2 years ago, but also because we want this ADU to be around for many years. Even though we're advocating it to be built for modern elders, this structure should be able to exist and be sustained and actually house other people if need be, and if wanted, like people returning from college, or a caregiver, or just a service person from the town who doesn't want to drive an hour and a half to get to work. And that's a very big use for ADUs. And then we decided that the best way to incentivize our young designers would to actually delineate an actual property so they would know what they were designing for. And we were lucky enough to have a homeowner in Montclair give us their survey for the design. Now you'll see this survey shows a rather generous front yard, a rather generous backyard, and a 1.5 story frame dwelling that is sort of recognizable to a lot of people in first ring suburbs. There were some challenges here, and one of the major challenges was how to get to the backyard easily. If you can see, there's a vinyl fence here and a little shed, and the architectural students had to figure out how to create a walkway to the backyard. You'll also notice there's no garage here. And we decided to use this because of what Christina said. Modern elders don't necessarily have cars. Many of them depend upon Uber and other kinds of transportation, or if they're going to be living in this setting and they can barter with somebody who's living in the other unit to provide some transportation, that's another way to solve the problem. But the other component is walkability, as we've already heard. Modern elders thrive in a town that's walkable, and we really want to get towns to start thinking about walkability in order to sustain older people living there. So we start with this design, and we had 43 people register for the contest. We had 31 of them qualify for submissions, which was a very good number. We learned from the competition it is possible to build an aesthetically pleasing and functional ADU that is compatible with our streetscape. Our specifications were that the minimum would be 575 square feet, and it would go up to 1,200 square feet. Why 575 square feet? Here's where some of our zoning issues started to come into play. There's something called a permeability restriction. That is, there's just so much of your backyard you can cover with a permeable structure without violating the town zoning because of stormwater management. As I mentioned, we had some flooding here 2 years ago, and there's a high sensitivity now about permeability, to the point where that walkway I showed you on the diagram on the property has to be a permeable concrete block. It cannot be impermeable, because that could actually cause more stormwater problems. We also found that it was possible to sensitize these young architects to the needs of our cohort, modern elders, and that they took it seriously in terms of the design. And that's a real win-win. Then, of course, as you've already heard, the FDA guidelines for financing construction are now becoming more supportive. But there is still one very big issue for modern elders. That is, many of us don't have a lot of years ahead in which the banks can collect their interest. So there is an issue about long-term mortgages and financing of these constructions. And lastly, as I said before, local zoning is a major factor in whether ADUs are actually built. 25 people applied to put up ADUs after Montclair passed its ordinance. Only 4 were approved for construction. Now, that has a lot to do with conservative views of how land should be used. It has something to do with stormwater. It also has to do with a reluctance to use any modular construction. So everything here would have to be built from scratch. Delicious pancakes, but very expensive to build. And the other thing that was very, very important in Montclair were privacy issues. Our zoning law requires a 6-foot setback from the neighbor. And if you have a typical backyard, a 6-foot setback is probably going to put the ADU right in the middle of your backyard, so that your neighbor on either side of you is not having to see your eyeballs out of the windows. This was a challenge also for our young architecture students, who had to find a way to protect the privacy of the neighbors. So we had, as I said, 6 winners. There were cash prizes. Let's make sure I can get to the designs from here. Oh, well, I'm going to have to stop the PowerPoint and go to the website to get to the designs. Hold on a minute. Okay, I apologize for that.
No, go ahead.
That's why I wanted you to do all this, right? Okay, hold on a minute. Okay.
It was really interesting, and that the of course the ADUs don't cause the flooding, but now that there's a heightened sense of building to address flooding, that's going to impact changes and new ideas.
Yes, and it's actually going to impact all kinds of construction, and maybe even a reluctance to create densification. So that's something we really have to be mindful of. All right, so the first place winner is the Lit Hearth, and I see, in the interest of time, I may have to rush through this.
Okay. Actually, we don't see it on the screen.
Oh dear. Okay, I got to go back.
No worries.
Okay, hold on a minute. Stop sharing. Share. Do you see it now?
Yes.
Oh,
and it's awesome.
Okay. So you'll notice that this, oops, what happened?
I'll just toggle back.
All right. I don't know where I am.
So, Anne, if you see the ADU first place winner, if you just click on that part of it.
Wait a minute. I don't see what you see. Yes, you do.
Perfect.
Okay. There you go. You got it.
All right. Modern elders were not native to this technology, Christina. Comes more naturally to younger people. Anyhow, this is the lit hearth. This was our first place winner. It is 800 square feet. It is scaled to the neighborhood, and it reflects combining indoor and outdoor spaces with a good airflow and light. It's barrier free, and it has wheelchair and walker accessibility. If you'll notice, there's a central, you can't really see it here, there's a central fireplace which divides the space, and the bedroom is a sanctuary in a quiet corner here. So our judges like this for the airflow, for the outdoor patio, which faces the fence as opposed to the main house, and the different level of roofs, which actually gives us an opportunity for more light and air into the dwelling without actually encroaching on the privacy of the neighbors. All right, so now we'll go back and see if I can figure out how to get to the next one. Nope, that's not going to work. Okay, I'm going to have to stop share and start again.
No worries.
Okay.
While she's doing that, Marina and Christina, you were on the you were some of the judges on this, and so what was it about that design that you gave it first place?
I think that all of the designs were quite amazing and very interesting, and it was very interesting also to say how different all the judges felt about them. So coming to a consensus was kind of a fun process. So I think we tried to find kind of a balance between them all, and I think it was a combination of the relation of how to build a small place to live that felt larger than it was and created indoor and outdoor rooms that allowed privacy for both the main house and the accessory dwelling unit to sort of live together and coexist. And I think the first one was really artfully done in sort of making that large space extend with light and air and really creating exciting places to live. And then the second one that Anne is about to talk about was a very sort of different way of dealing with privacy. And it was an interesting variation on how to consider what would we consider fitting given a traditional original house and a new unit in the backyard. So, Anne, now that you have the picture up, back to you.
Well, yes, and this one was Marina's favorite, so it's almost like I'm going to send it back to you, Marina. But this is the Sway house, and this, you know, the expression location, location, location. Well, that was the major preoccupation of the designer of this particular house. As you can see, it's not a conventional design at all. It's built upon an A-frame, and the benefit of this is the privacy that the ADU has with respect to the main house. But more than that, it's the garden in back of this house that's been captured. The tree was there, and this particular design makes at the center of the back of the house where all of the glazing is, where all of the windows are. There are some other windows on the sides that respect the privacy of the neighbors. They are very creative, very different, and very, very expensive to replace if they break. So, Marina, did you want to make any more comments about this particular design?
No, I think that's perfect. Thank you.
Okay, now let's make sure if I get back to stop, I have to stop the share again and get back to the next winner. I appreciate everybody's patience here.
What I loved about that design with the sway house, it almost seems like I don't know, it seems like something that would be so far away from New Jersey. It's so light and airy and just really creative.
Yeah, we had actually a really interesting discussion about the sort of matching or not matching of homes to the style of the original home. And the discussion was whether seniors would, or no, not seniors,
Modern elders.
modern elders are not stuck on specific styles, and having something that, first of all, would be an exciting place to be, an exciting place to rent, but
Yes.
also if one were to rent it out, it would be such a treat that they would have absolutely zero trouble renting something like that.
Yeah, right.
So here's the third place design, and this is also 800 square feet. And I have to tell you that 40% of the submissions were at 800 square feet. It seemed to have been a sweet spot in terms of accommodating all the things that we know modern elders are looking for. Now, you'll notice in this particular design, there's an overhang by the door, which was considered very favorable because it's protected from the elements. There is a bedroom that's in a quiet corner that's sort of away from the activity of the rest of the house. There is this very open plan, and there is an inner courtyard, which is hard to see here. Let's see if I can find a picture where the inner courtyard is showing a little bit better. Okay, I think that's it. And that inner courtyard is good for introducing light, and it was also suitable for sitting, so that there is actually like a private patio, but not taking up so much outdoor space that we would have exceeded the permeability limitations of this particular design. I have to tell you, we brought this entire exhibit, to the Montclair Public Library, and there was a lot of excitement about this design. People actually could see themselves living in it. It also had the benefit of the green roof, which is another one of those sustainable features that makes for better water retention and stormwater management. Christina and Marina, was there anything else about this design that you remembered?
I think you did a great job covering it.
Exactly.
All right, now we go to some of the what we call bested categories. These were designs that were actually very impressive, but didn't make the final cut for one reason or another. But we wanted to make sure that they were given some sort of what's the word? Acknowledgement for the work that they had done, what they added to the conversation. So, as I said, 575 square feet is a pretty challenging amount, but actually can be done, and can be done very stylishly. This is called On the Fence, and this was done by 3 students from MIT. And On the Fence is very, very cleanly designed to maximize the space. You can see from the pictures that there's a little bit of hallway here with closets, and closets were, I admit, in short supply in many of the designs. But the jurors did have a little issue with the narrowness of this hallway and the closets being here, even though this hallway is big enough for a wheelchair or a walker. I will say that every one of the designs was big enough for a wheelchair or a walker. And one of the things we liked about this particular design was that the architectural students talked a lot about community. They called it On the Fence, not because fences separate, but because fences actually create neighbors. And as you know, Robert Frost said, good fences create good neighbors, and they were echoing that one. Okay, so now we'll stop the share on that one, and we'll go on.
And actually, in the interest of time, can you I'll talk to you about, can I send out the design winners to everybody?
Yes.
And I wanted to open up to questions for you and Christina and Marina. We were just over an hour. These were such great examples. And what I find very interesting is how, and your examples are the ADUs are incorporating the recent modern environmental focus. So they can be part of the solution, and maybe a way to move these forward is to work with the environmental initiatives in a community.
Well, the third one that I didn't show you actually has a way of collecting runoff water, storing it under the ADU, and repurposing it in the house. And that was a really interesting design.
Wow. So does anybody have questions? You can unmute yourself if you'd like to ask something in general or to one of our specific speakers, or you can just type it in the chat if that's easier. Let me see what we have in the chat here. Terrific presentation. Yes. Well, I think that maybe you were so thorough that you have left no questions unanswered.
Kathy? Hi.
Go ahead, Marilyn.
I actually have a couple questions. I don't want to monopolize the time if other people have questions, but I'm wondering, in other parts of the country where ADUs are being used, has there been any data about the effect on property values of ADUs? Because I would think there might be some pushback from communities because of a fear of a reduction in property value or resale value. Any data that's been collected about that?
That's a really great question, Marilyn. I will say off the top of my head, I don't know of any studies that have looked at the increase or decrease in property values, only because a lot of these ordinances and statewide laws are so new that the repercussions of it on the market hasn't really been reflected. I will say there have been studies in general, and by and large, adding more housing to a neighborhood does not decrease property values. That's more like considering larger multifamily structures. I don't know, Marina, if you've heard of anything.
I definitely agree with, there's been a ton of research done that when even multi-unit affordable apartments are added to the neighborhood, there is no impact in any way to reduce property values. We do have, the data set is very small, but we do have evidence in Princeton where people have put ADUs on properties and they've been sold separately. And there's been a lot of nervousness where what would happen to the price of the actual main home. Having reduced the area of the lot, because a portion of the lot has been allocated to the ADU and sold separately, that didn't even reduce the price of the single family home sold separately on the same property. So at this point in time, we only have a sample of 3 of those being sold. But in all 3 cases, there was no reduction to the actual sale of the price. And that has actually been used as a complaint that the people thought like, okay, well, having an ADU will reduce the value of the property. But that didn't even do it. So we have such a shortage, such constraint on the demand, on the supply side, that we're not seeing any reduction in values of the real estate properties. And there's so much interest. The other category that we haven't talked about really is multi-generational living, where people are buying properties with ADUs specifically because they are looking to have both family and grandparents living together. So there's a huge market and huge demand where people just looking specifically to purchase something like that.
So let me just add, because we interviewed quite a few of the realtors in town, and they corroborated that having an ADU on the property was actually increasing some of the bidding wars in trying to getting these properties. So I don't think it's something you have to worry about in terms of value going down.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks to Christina for answering some of the questions in the chat. I saw William Scott, you had your hand up. Did they answer your question or would you like to ask yours?
Yes, I think they answered the question, but just so I'm clear, how about from a new construction standpoint, not only building the single family unit, but building the ADU if the zoning is appropriate at that at that point in time? Is that something that we should consider as an additional option? And also, Ann, I just wanted to double check. From a leasing standpoint, the ADUs can only have an annual lease. We're not going to get involved in short-term rentals and things like that.
Correct.
Okay, okay.
Well, actually, I think the ordinance might say something about a minimum of 90 days, but I don't remember for a fact.
Okay, okay.
And there are towns that do have bans on like Airbnb type of situations. So in a separate ordinance, that might be addressed by the town.
But my question from a new construction standpoint, not only to build the single family unit home, but to build the ADU at the same time, which would be more attractive or an additional benefit to the seller of a new home.
Absolutely. I think that is really excellent question, and that is already happening. And what one could do is these accessory dwelling units could be a lot of confusion is, especially following our McMansion discussion, it doesn't mean that ADUs are something extra or they make the impact of something bigger. The way the ADUs, 99% of all the ordinances are written, is you get to use the same volume that's available to develop on a certain property, but instead of building one gigantic object, you could take it and make it into a main house and an accessory dwelling unit, or you can make one volume and have separate portions of it. And it is really, really beneficial. People are very much looking into it, of building new construction that could be used both ways, or people would have a separate suite in the home that could be an ADU rented separately, or it could be an au pair suite, or could be a suite for grandparents visiting for 6 months. Or sometimes we also plan for, sometimes, you know, you break a leg and you can't go upstairs onto the second floor, and it's really great to have a full-blown suite on the first floor rather than trying to, you know, sleep in the living room. So these things, you're absolutely right. That's a really, really good way to think about it moving forward.
Yeah, and just jumping on what Marina was saying, I know in Maplewood, I was lucky enough to be giving a presentation in South Orange, and we had the attorney from Maplewood there, and she, if I recall correctly, as she was explaining it, one of the first permitted ADUs in Maplewood was actually a relatively light lift because the house had already been built with a mother-in-law suite inside the property, essentially. It just hadn't been being used as it. And it was a very easy thing for the homeowner to work with the town to say, okay, can we bring this back online as an ADU? And everything was pretty much there. It was just like a little bit of paperwork that needed to be filled out with the town. So there are, in some instances, properties that are already kind of built to allow this kind of multi-generational living. It just might not be like 100% on the books, or they might be grandfathered in. They might need a little bit of tweaks in terms of building code and access and things like that. But it's not always a huge lift. It just depends on the individual structure that we're dealing with.
Well, I want to thank everybody. In the interest of time, we've gone a little bit over, and I hate to stop the discussion because I think there's a lot more to say about this. So we will look to doing another event maybe in a few months. So we can answer more questions and track the progress. I hope there will be more stories of things being built, especially those award winners in Montclair. Very intriguing. Again, thank you for joining us today. And I really want to thank our speakers, Christina Kata, Marina, Rubina, and Ann Lippel, for sharing your experience on this really important topic. I will send out the recording and information to everybody, including the sign-on letter and information about the pending state bill on ADUs. Thank you for joining us, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you.